Tom Davis together with Jim Duquette, and I thought with Jim, because he does a national radio show on Sirius XM, that we could talk about some things that are possibly going to go on with baseball in the not too distant future. I'm not talking about now between now and the end of the season. I'm talking about 2022, 2023. And let's talk a little bit about the umpires may be replaced by robo-umpires. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've had mixed feelings about this one from the beginning. Starting with replay, where we've seen almost 40% of the calls get overturned. We're trying to get the calls right, and so a lot of times the thought process is, well, let's try to get every call right, and it's not humanly possible. And I think with that, with even the balls and strikes, it becomes really difficult to expect robots to be able to do it. Now, if they could do it accurately, and you have what they're talking about, talking about putting an earpiece in an umpire, home plate umpire. They have it it's set up, and then it signals to the umpire, hey, that was a strike, whatever, and he's going to give us a call. I guess I'm okay with that aspect of it, but there's still a human element there that I feel like is a part of this game that we're losing, and I'm not so sure that that's going to be the right way to go. You're always going to get complaints. Like the players are always going to complain about a bad ball or strike call. One way or the other, even if there's a robot there. So I don't know what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, if it improves it a little bit, I guess I'm for it. But I feel like I'm sitting on the fence because I haven't seen the technology work with my own eyes. I think that's part of the issue for me.
One of the things we've lost with instant replay is the umpires arguing with the managers and all. I miss seeing that just watching a game.
We get a little bit of it,
yeah,
but you get more arguments. Recently I saw with the A's and Bob Melvin arguing about how could they overturn the call through replay, which you can't do. It's an automatic ejection. So what are you doing? So I think that you're right. That confrontation you miss. I think from the umpire side of things, they rather it this way. They rather not get yelled at, and sometimes get sprayed with whatever when the argument's going on. I think in the end, if you were asking the manager, they probably at the end don't like yelling and screaming at the umpires, even though it's entertaining for us.
Years ago, if you followed the game many years ago, it used to be you'd have a 10-man pitching staff, and now the numbers are getting up there like to 14 on a regular basis, and you probably might use somewhere between 25 and 30 pitchers a year between going to the minors and coming back up and all. What are your thoughts on the possibility that Major League Baseball is talking about limiting the number of pitchers on the 26-man roster to just 13?
Well, I think this is a competition issue that I like. I look at it, some of the teams that are carrying 14, some are carrying 15 pitchers on a 26-man roster. I feel like in a lot of ways, not everyone has top-notch pitching. I think the higher revenue teams, for the most part, have the best pitching, more veteran-type pitching that you can rely on. And they tend to carry more experienced guys on their roster. I feel like there's a little bit of a disadvantage for the smaller revenue teams or teams that are careful about their payroll. So I feel like, and by the way, if you have players that are young, and the options, which we've seen the Orioles do in the past very well with the option of players, those other clubs, those large revenue clubs, they tend to have veteran guys who don't have options, but they're able to carry them on their roster a little bit longer. So I feel like in that sense, hopefully I'm explaining it right, it's been more of an advantage for the large revenue clubs that I'd like to see go away. If you go with 13, you have to use your AAA roster more, you have young players more, and have guys, pitchers with options. And I feel like that benefits the smaller revenue teams than it does the larger ones.
One stat that I saw just recently, it was kind of interesting about the pitchers. They're using more than 8 pitchers per game now, and it used to be like under 6 per game. What are your thoughts on just trying to hold that down, or maybe they're asking too much out of the pitchers?
I think a lot of it starts with the starting pitching, right? So if you take your starters out after 2 times through the lineup, sometimes you're not getting through 5 innings, and now like the Rays will never go more than 5 batters with a pitcher a lot of times in the bullpen in relief. And so that's where you start to see this number 6, 7, 8 pitchers in a game, or worse, you have an opener that goes, 4 batters, 5 batters, and then it's like a reliever an inning. Like, it's getting to be absurd in some of these areas. But it's working when it comes to wins and losses, so teams are going to use it more. So I'm not a big fan of that. I think that there's some ways that they can tweak it with a starting pitcher. I don't know how you do it, but we have to do a better job, I think, of the number of pitchers that are being used.
It seems like this year there's been less of the opener than it has been in the last 2 or 3 years.
You know, I felt like Tampa got rid of the opener, at least at the beginning of the season. They had 5 legitimate starters, and they traded a couple, and a couple got hurt, like Glasnow. They traded Rich Hill, and they went back to the opener again. It was like, hey, this is a full circle feeling. Now they've got 2 starters in particular, in McClanahan, the lefty, young lefty, and righty Luis Patino, that are 2 power arms that, you know, they're back to the, you know, getting a starting pitcher to at least go 5 innings. So, you know, there's a method and a means to using the opener, but I feel like you're saying it's been a little bit lesser, at least with Tampa. You got it.
Now, I want to ask you about this pitch clock. I mean, supposedly there is a pitch clock, but nobody enforces it. Could they start enforcing it in the, say, next season?
I mean, they tried to do it, if you remember, one year, and the veteran pitchers balked at it, and you know, were threatening to disrupt the game. It's just like if you remember when they tried to enforce batters staying in the batter's box. This is when David Ortiz was still playing, and he got upset, and he was disruptive. And I think what you're trying to do is you try to get, and they've done this at the minor league level, you try to get this pitch clock where pitchers through the system are used to it. They're being aggressive and getting their sign and delivering the pitch. And if they do that in a timely manner, the hope is that you don't need to have the clock. I think at some point, though, I just saw this, I don't know if you saw this, the average game time now is 3 hours and 6 minutes. Now, there's a time when we would get fined when I was in the Major League Baseball office if it was 2 hours and 40 minutes. If that was a long game, they'd said, you know what, you're going to be fined $5,000 if you don't improve on your time. Now we're over 3. You know, the only way you can really bring it down, in my opinion, is to put a pitch clock on there at some point. I think it's going to have to come, and I just don't know exactly when.
Maybe they got to extend the pitcher's innings a little bit instead of having them, you know, pitch 1 inning and then you take them out. The one thing that I can remember, too, back in the 60s and the 70s, they used to have a starting pitcher, say like Mike Cuellar, Jim Palmer for the Orioles, even Dave McNally, and all. They would start a game, and the game would be over in 2 hours and 10 minutes, maybe 2 hours and 15 minutes. It was just a different pacing altogether.
I think the average game time during that period was 2 hours and 12 minutes. Yeah. I think that number stands out in my mind. It's an odd number, 212, but it's like you know, and you know, and certainly, you know, they're out there, they're going 9 innings, they get on a pace where they're you know, in a rhythm, and they're just delivering the pitch. And you know, I'm not suggesting that we're going to be able to get to that point, but you should be able to deliver the pitch in under 10 or 12 seconds. Part of the issue with them holding the ball a little longer is a health and a recovery type of thing too. So some of these pitchers, they're used to throwing 95, 97, 98 miles an hour, but you can't do it within 10 seconds all the time as you get tired. So if you're willing to step off and delay a little bit, then the recovery comes back and you're able to maintain that high velocity. So it is a performance-related issue that these pitchers have figured out. I'm not so sure at the end of the day how we're going to fix this issue, but we got it.
Well, when you look at the strikeouts, that to me is kind of an interesting story because you need at least 3 strikes to get a strikeout, and now they're averaging 18 strikeouts combined for both teams per game. I mean, there was nowhere near that number in yesteryear, and I'm just saying one of the reasons why the games are stretched out to 306, like you said, is because of the strikeouts. Because
of the strikeouts, and they're fouling off pitchers too. You know, there is still some of that, but there is a lot of strikeouts. There's a lot of inaction. Listen, part of the commissioner's goal here is to have a pace of play, improve the pace of play. Part of that is putting the ball in play. It's a lot of things that you need to do. I think guys got to put the ball in play more. You got to cut down on the strikeouts. That's a different philosophy when it comes to swinging the bat. I also think you got to get rid of the overshifting. All this overshifting, you know, when guys hit a line drive the other way or pull the ball to the pull side and it doesn't get rewarded because a great defensive player, you overshift. I think you're encouraging guys to have this launch angle, hit the ball over the fence, and that's slowing the game down a lot, in my opinion, too.
Another stat I saw just recently was that the batting average, on average for all 30 teams combined, is like 237 as team. Now we're talking about the team batting average all together, combining them all. And when you look back at that, that's the lowest since World War II. Now when you consider that, the shift has to have taken into account, taking so many hits away from players.
Well, and that's what a lot of hitters say. The reason is why they had that kind of launch angle and hitting the ball in the air and pulling the ball over, you know, is hitting the ball over the shift rather than trying to put singles together and hit the ball against a shift, which, by the way, I haven't seen a little bit more of adjustments in that regard, but I think you would just allow their natural hitters to swing the bat and pull the ball through the hole if you weren't over shifts. If you want the shortstop and third baseman way over to the third base side, that's fine, but you shouldn't be allowed to take the second baseman and put him where the shortstop normally is. That, to me, is really why we've seen as many hits get caught and why you're seeing those team batting averages really drop.
I know Buck Showalter was a big advocate of making sure you had 2 infielders to the left of second,
Yes.
2 to the right of second. They had to be on the dirt. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm totally in agreement with Buck what he has to say, because the other aspect of that is when they're playing, in the outfield, it's almost like that extra fielder when you in softball, in slow pitch softball, you see where they're playing that shallow outfielder with 4 outfielders. That's what they're doing. They're taking those infielders, they're putting them in the outfield, grass 10, 12, 14 feet out in the outfield. To me, you're taking away hits that way too. So I would eliminate any of those overshifts, any of the infielders going to the outfield, any of that stuff. To me, the NBA does a good job of making adjustments, right? Man-to-man to zone, back and forth. We need to do something in Major League Baseball.
Do you think that left-handed hitters have been harmed? Say like
Yes.
Chris Davis. It seems like his career changed for hitting when the shift started being more prevalent.
Here's why I think, the answer to that is yes. So if you look at the way the infields are overshifted, you can take the third baseman, you can move him as far as you want towards second bases. And if the left-handed hitter can't hit the ball the other way to third base, then he's in big trouble. The right-handed hitters, they don't have the same issue because you can't pull the first baseman all the way over to second base. He has to be near the bag to take the throws across the diamond. So there's only so far off the bag he can play generally in that shift. So I do think inherently there's a disadvantage for left-handed hitters, but again, it goes to the point of, all right, let's figure out a way to hit the ball the other way. And if they could do that, I think you'd see it even out.
There's been some rumors that they might try to take the pitching slab and back it up another foot.
Yeah.
So instead of 60 feet 6 inches, it'll be a foot longer to throw the ball. What can that do to pitchers, and is it a good possible move?
Well, they're doing it, they're testing it in the Atlantic League, which I do like that aspect. If you're going to change any of these rules, test them in the minor leagues first, right? And let's get some more data. They had a test where the ASMI, the American Sports Medicine Institute down in Birmingham, Alabama, tested with college pitchers. They only did fastballs, and they didn't see any adverse effect or any additional issues with the elbow and the arm. But that's very, very limited. They didn't test breaking balls. They didn't test older players, older pitchers. So for me, you're not going to test any major league pitchers. They're making too much money. You can't, and I cannot imagine, Tom, and I know you've been watching this a long time. The mound has been this far since what? Before 1900, right?
Right.
There's no chance. I cannot imagine that they're going to move that mound back and get any pitcher, major league pitcher, to buy in and say it's going to be okay.
The only thing they really did to the mound in recent memory is lowering it when Bob Gibson had a 1.12 earned run average after the '68 season, and to try to, help the hitters out a little bit because,
Right.
In '67, one of the stats that stands out to me is Carl Yastrzemski won the Triple Crown, and he won the batting title with a 301 batting average. How many times has that ever happened in baseball? But he didn't have to face Bob Gibson until the World Series. But I'm just saying that, some of those things that are occurring. Can you imagine throwing a pitch in the dirt? It'll be out there 3 feet and 4 feet in front of the plate.
Well, and some of the pitchers that were interviewed in a recent article in the Athletic about this particular set said, once they got used to it, they didn't feel any extra stress on it, but it did impact their curve balls and their breaking balls and where they had to look and where their target was and the big break to it. And coincidentally or not, you didn't see an uptick in offense with the mound being moved back, and the strikeouts stayed the same or went up. So what they're trying to do is trying to create more offense, and it didn't happen. So I think that once at the end of the day they get this data back, they're going to realize there's not as much of an advantage for the hitters as they think.
Now, they talk also about making the bases bigger when you slide in or you can touch first base or whatever. What are your thoughts on, do the bases need to be made bigger?
The one area that I think the bases could be bigger is at first, right? So you're running down the line, you're running in foul territory, and then as you get to first base, that last step is in fair territory, right? And the first baseman is supposed to have his foot on the edge of the bag and everything else. But there are collisions there that cause injuries, in that bag. So you could extend the bag, almost like you see it some in softball, extend it into the foul territory so there's really no collision to avoid that. I could see a larger bag that way. You start making the bags bigger on the infield, now you're shortening the distance It's not 90 feet, it's 89 feet 6 inches or whatever, and there's a lot of bang bang play. So for me, you'll see a lot more stolen bases in that sense, and I would be careful. You get this unintended consequences that happen sometimes when you change the rules. I don't know.
How about the stat that's out there now that it's like 3 minutes and 51 seconds between times that the ball's in play and not in play in the game? I mean, I would have never thought that number existed until they've done research on it.
Well, so these guys, when they're measuring these things, they measure everything. Every little, the amounts of time they're staying out of the box, they have an average for that. How amount of times the guy's standing in the batter's box, the amount of time he stepped off the mound, what's that period? Like every little aspect is timed, so they can get a better sense of where is the most time that's wasted. And a lot of that is in between. Okay, well, why is that? Is it because the pitch isn't being delivered? Is it because the batters are stepping out of the batter's box? They're trying to come up with these answers to see if they can shorten up that amount of time between action.
When I look at the game, I mean, I've watched it since I was a little kid, first grade, 1954, and I've enjoyed it. I enjoyed the concept of it. Now, it just seems like sometimes they want to make change for the sake of change. Is that accurate or not?
It feels that way sometimes, and I think that you're going from a commissioner, Commissioner Selig, who was old school, like you're talking about, and didn't want to make any changes, to somebody with Commissioner Manfred, who's trying to look ahead and realize, okay, maybe the game needs to be freshened up a little bit with some changes. The NFL changes the game a little bit here and there. Nothing materially different, but there are changes on how they rule certain plays, whether what's viewed as a touchdown, what are reviewable touchdowns or not. So they go through that. And same thing in the NBA, right? We talked a little bit about defenses and offenses and whatever. To me, if you're changing a lot of these things in baseball, you're talking about changing the mound, that's like taking the rim in basketball, going from 10 feet to 10 and a half feet. Like, you can't do that. Yeah. Like, there's certain things you just can't touch. And I think that's where we're getting into, I think, some gray area for me in some of these rule changes.
Did you ever think that you'd see the game the way it is right now from the standpoint of, like we're talking about changes, and yet they're even talking about returning to some of the stuff, like the shifts and all. In other words, it's almost like they're experimenting without locking things in.
Yeah, they allowed certain things, and now that they've had a chance to see them, they're realizing that it's not good for the game, so they're going to go back. I think that's what you're seeing. I think that 7-inning games. There had been some talk about going to 7-inning games. I think people realize we don't want to go to 7-inning games anymore. The extra inning rule might stick around, but it may be 11 innings before we have the runner on second base instead of 10.
And then when you look at change, I mean, I understand there's got to be change. They got to attract the younger audience, so there's no doubt about that. But the whole world has changed so dramatically. Look, when I was a kid, you had 3 TV channels, and you had, you listened to the game on the radio or you went out there. It's definitely changed from that.
It's changed from that. There's so many people that are on the phones. You watch them in the game, and they're down in their heads. So they're trying to keep their attention too. Some of these young pitchers and young fans trying to keep their attention.
Always a pleasure talking with Jim Duquette. Thanks for the last half hour, and we'll see you next week with another edition. This is Tom Davis. Thank you for watching. Take me out to the ball game.